In this episode, we react to the numbers that suggest that young men are having a tough time holding down romantic relationships, at least as relative to historic trends. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who's known to toot his own horn from time to time, Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to throw out some of your favorite things today, or are you more in a sentimental mood?
Let's see. That's a good question. I'll be sentimental today.
All right. There we go. All right,
sentimental.
Hey,
you might even make me cry today. Let's see. Let's see what happens, bro.
We'll see what happens. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe and like on YouTube or your podcast platform. Doing so really helps the show out. Now, we're recording on March 21st, 2025. And as far as young people and dating, we've seen some really interesting numbers get thrown out in recent discussions on the topic. One comes from a 2022 Pew Research Center survey, which found that 63% of men under 30 said they're single. Now, and this is contrast to only 34% of women in that age range said they were single. And, that's obviously women can date older men or something like that. It's not the numbers don't need to line up exactly. But considering men and women have been doing this kind of this relationship dance since the beginning of our species, it just seems a bit odd that nearly 2/3 of men in kind of this their prime, at least from a physical standpoint, are sitting on the sidelines, from a relationship standpoint. So, Tunde, what are your thoughts on this research suggesting that young men are really having a tough time, having a tough go at it, as far as holding down, maintaining romantic relationships with women?
Well, first, I appreciate your observation that human beings have been doing this relationship thing for a while. I never thought of it like that, but I was like, yeah, the fact that you and I exist actually.
Hey, man.
Good evidence. And the fact that every
animals
generation
have been doing it for a long time.
I know. That's why I just interested, like, yeah, actually, you're right. So, no, but I find this another interesting topic, I feel like, in our current cultural dialogue, because clearly, like you said, I mean, we'll be citing the stats and things that we've obviously read and researched, but clearly the figures and stats appear to back up this idea that the way young people under 30, are engaging with each other in a romantic way, if I can sound really technical about it, is much different than those of us who are older and maybe even from prior generations. So I do think there's something there. I think, and I say this in all fairness to the younger generation. I mean, I'm after reading some of the stuff I read, I'm like, man, I'm glad I'm out of that dating scene. I'm glad I've been married for a long time, because it seems like life is a lot harder for younger people as relates to relationships in general. And I know that we're kind of leading here with romantic relationships, but in the reading I did and just understanding also the nature of the internet, things like that, which I know we'll get into, it was evident that especially young men more than young women are having a tough time just building relationships, platonic or romantic.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking of the things we've talked about in the past too, like the epidemic of loneliness.
Yeah.
And I just thought, there's something swimming in this kind of stew of ingredients that they're all kind of connected as well. So, that's to me what I found interesting.
One of the things for me that this kind of recalled back is, we did the book Sapiens a while back. And in that, the author talked about how one of the advantages, or one of the things that can be an advantage for human beings, is cultural evolution. And that, with animals that operate on instinct, it requires real evolution in order for them to kind of change their stripes, like in order to adapt and to adjust and so forth. Whereas humans oftentimes are able to adjust to new conditions. It's why humans are able to spread out all over the world and all these different climates, all these different, everything, and to adjust to that is not because our bodies, our biology changed, but because culturally we adapt and then we change and stuff like that. So what this really seems to me, because I don't think that the men now are like fundamentally different from a biological standpoint from the men in past. Like maybe people across the board are more overweight now than they used to be, at least in America. But, the stuff still works the same more or less. But I think from a cultural standpoint, basically, must be something going on. Like as opposed to looking at the men and saying, what's wrong with these dudes? It's like, well, what's going on in our culture? And so that's what really, like, that's what I'm looking at with this is like, okay, so we're in a culture right now where either 2/3 of men, whatever percentage of them, are unable to or undesiring of, hey, let's have let me find a woman to be with and to kind of try to grow and develop with and stuff like that. Either they don't want that or they're not able to do it. And so I'm saying for it to be a trend like this, it has to be something within the culture, the way that we're kind of living life. And, like, there are many culprits for that. One of the things that I've seen brought up with this is kind of like the establishing relationships like that, those initial steps, there's a level of discomfort that can be in that, going out of your comfort zone. And then when relationships end, there's a level of discomfort after that, like there can be, how your heart broken or whatever, or just all that kind of stuff. So there are these friction points that if you feel like you have all these other alternatives, so to speak, for whatever reason, whether it be porn or whether it be social media, feeling like you have all these options. You're not just in a town of 1,000 and it's like, yo, man, I only got so many options, so I better find one before they're all the ones that I would want are gone. And so, like, there must be psychological things going on. So that to me is really where the meat of this is. It's like, well, what's going on to make people feel like either they don't need them or the juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak.
Yeah, well, let's tease that out. I want to give a stat, and then we can address this kind of ideas, because I'm reading from one of the articles that
we'll have this here in the show notes as well.
Yeah. So a 2023 poll from the Survey Center on American Life found that 56% of Gen Z adults said they'd been in a relationship. Said they'd been in a romantic relationship at any point in their teen years, compared with 76% of Gen Xers and 78% of baby boomers.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting is it says that ages 18 to 34 reported not having a steady partner, 54% of them in 2021. And in 2004, that number was only 33%. So that to me was like, all right, so something's happened in the last 20 years. Why is it that people within this age range, 18 to 34, why have people that have never been in a relationship, how's that skyrocketing?
Half in that situation. And this is not 30. Just saying, were they in a relationship at that moment? Because that's obviously 2021. There's the pandemic going on. So that creates its own hurdles. But this is like, had you been in one at all? And half are like, nah.
Well, that's why I think you're right. Your question about what has happened culturally is, I think, the right question. Because the other point you alluded to is very accurate, which was the human body has not changed in one or two generations. So we know that it's not
fundamental way. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not, so it's not something about the mechanics, hormones, or anything like that. But I think,
I'll say this, it could be something with the hormones, apparently these plastics are.
Yeah. I'm going to say, let's not get into too much of that, because that's a unknown. Conversation. But and that's unknown right now. But the thing is that I think what we can say that we know, and that's why I think this really, to me, a lot falls on the parents, to be honest with you. I think that the style of parenting has changed a lot in the last generation or two. Parents are much more fearful of letting their kids outside and things, the idea of young kids. I tell this story often, actually, that my mom put me on a bus for the first time when I was 9 years old in Washington, D.C.
You're talking about the city bus, right?
She walked me. We walked to the bus station.
But a city bus.
Yeah. No, but we walked to the bus station together. I remember she asked the bus driver, I'm teaching my son to ride the bus. Can he sit right behind you? You just make sure he's okay. And he goes, yeah. And she goes, how long does it take you to do your route? He says, an hour and a half. So she looked me right in the face and said, I'll be right here waiting for you when you come back. Watch how people come and put the money, blah, blah, blah. And I remember I sat there, and when the route was over, my mom was there waiting for me. And she looked at me when I got off and said, now you know how to ride the bus. So from age 9 in Washington, D.C., I was riding the bus in the metro by myself. And I wasn't the only kid doing that. And what I realized is I'm thinking about this stuff when I was preparing for the show today, of these reading about this, reminding me. I don't remember all my interactions, but I'm sure as just a 10, 11, 12-year-old kid, having that type of independence, what was I doing? I was dealing with adults from time to time, right? I was paying for my tickets and getting change from the machine. I was learning how to be more self-sufficient, more self-confident. And today, if you see a 9 or 10-year-old kid walking around some city by themselves, probably, someone's calling the police and their parents would be put in jail. So I think part of it is young people are less exposed to opportunities to be independent today than they ever have been in the past.
Yeah.
And probably a function of things like we'll get into, like technology, right? Kids are inside playing video games, stuck on TV. Parents are freaked out by
parenting
algorithms.
styles have changed.
Yeah, because how many times, James, I don't know about you, but I've talked to peer parents of mine that'll say, oh, well, today's just different. Kids aren't as safe. And I'm thinking, like, first of all, when we were kids and probably prior generations, things like child molestation and things like that, people just didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Today's culture, we train our kids that, like, hey, if someone looks at you funny or someone touches you, you ring the alarm.
They can walk around with a cell phone that has with GPS on it. Then you can see where they are at all times. Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like, that's
so if anything, it seems like it's safer now than it was. Like,
exactly.
Parents should just let their kids go and they'd be like, all right, come back.
I agree, James.
You don't know where they are the whole time.
This is like the disconnect we have. Like, it is actually safer than it's ever been at least in the American thing.
This gets into something different though, because that's.
But but let me just finish here. But we get told by now the technology how everything is so scary.
It's not just that though. It's just that we're aware of it more. Like when something is mentioned to you more and more often, the more sensitive you are that it's out there. So if it's not in conversation ever, then even if it's present, you're just not going to think about it. But if people bring it up a lot, then even if it's not sinister, they're bringing it up to scare you or anything like that. It's just going to be more on your mind. I mean, I think, yes, like that trend, that's the trend. What you're talking about there is something that's also been observed is just kind of kids maturing more slowly from a social standpoint.
Definitely.
And, like the first rites of passage, they're just doing later and later and later, whether it be move out of the house or, like try to get their own place or things like that. Like they're just, all of those things are being delayed. And that, of course, has to do with the parenting styles. Now, but you also touched on kind of at home playing video games, which is more the kid driven side. And that is, that's where I mentioned, like when I was talking about the friction, there are things in terms of like even meeting people in person. There's more friction involved in that apparently than just kind of friending people online. And, like there's you're not exposing yourself opening yourself up for rejection and stuff like that. And so I know like and this is anecdotal, but I mean, this kind of plays out over time is just being a young man at a time when there wasn't social media and you weren't able to just kind of with minimal friction, establish all these connections. You had to prepare yourself for the idea of facing rejection in order to go out and meet people. Like that was just part of it. You just had to like steel yourself for the fact that, okay, well, if I'm going to talk to people, then some people are going to be like, yeah, hey, what's good? And other people are going to be like, nah, I'm not interested. And like, so that was kind of, you had to go through that. And then after a while, some people get to the point where it's just a numbers game. It's like, all right, well, if I talk to 10, I might get 4 or 5, but I have 0 if I didn't talk to the 10, so I gotta get through the no's to get to the yes. It seems like, and the research suggests.
I'm laughing because you're absolutely correct.
That was just part of the understanding. And so, but that kind of rejection, I think, isn't necessarily the same as dealing with that online as it is in person. And so if you're not used to the idea that, hey, I'll talk to 3 people and maybe one of them will reciprocate, and the other 2 were just, I had to get to those other 2 to get to the one, then that can be very hurting. That can be hurtful. Yeah. So I think that part of it is honestly, it comes from the fact that just kind of putting yourself out there, like if you don't do it enough, then each individual up and down becomes says something about you personally. Whereas if you do it a lot, it's like, oh, well, no, that's just kind of the way the game goes. So I think, again, from a cultural standpoint, making certain things easier can remove incentives for things that may be rewarding, but ultimately have more friction involved in them. And I think meeting new people in person is one of those things. And so you end up making all these excuses. Like one of the pieces we're looking at today, in a Vox piece, it starts off talking about how, a guy's looking, what girls want to get picked up nowadays? And then the woman's like, me, like I would like to. So in that, I remember, kind of the conversations, and, I do want to kick it back to, because I want to get out of this topic pretty soon. But one of the conversations like that we had, 20 years ago or whatever, or 30 years ago was, oh, well, how come the guy always has to approach the woman? Yada, yada, yada. And we're talking about stuff like that. But that was more kind of, the conversation, the exercise of it. It's not like guys were like, all right, well, I'm just not going to approach women, because ultimately, like that's the way that the society evolved and the culture was evolved at that time. And it's a different culture now, which again
Well,
can be a strength for humans, but in other ways it may end up with situations like this where you got this wild divergence.
yeah, I think there's look, I think there's a lot coming at this topic. Probably we have our own blind spots right now, even because and probably be more research and things coming out because, there's so many interesting ways to look at it. One is you mentioned earlier something like the pandemic, which I do think had an effect on younger people, the ability to go out, socialize, all that. So that could be one thing.
And I want to specifically get to before we wrap up this. So I'm just like, what kind of factors do you think, are probably the ones that we should be looking at? And so, you're kind of
that's
let me just ask you the question to kind of frame.
So, because I got a few notes here, I'll go over because there's a couple of things. So, one is I do think that technology plays an effect, and I think that I've seen studies of things like the effect of the way that porn in with the internet, right? Because
how readily available it is.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So, and this is where we could be joking about this, but I'm going to be serious, right? Like when you and I were kids. No, I mean on a serious note, right? You and I were kids, like 12, 13, when boys are starting to figure it out. Literally, I remember I had to go sneak a Playboy magazine or a Hustler magazine, something like that, and that was
like
pretty
Mission
much
Impossible. And
that was
the whole soundtrack and everything.
And so. But
my bad. I know you're trying to be serious right now. So
yeah. So no, because I'm just trying to get through the linear motion in my mind here. Because basically, what happens is we still had to go figure it out if we actually wanted to go be with a girl, right? Like the magazine obviously was limited, and then you also all we had was TV, right? Generally, we didn't have a flat screen TV in every room in the house. We had one TV in the living room in the 80s and early 90s, right? So the thing is the ability for us to be stuck at home. We didn't have a PS5 and all this other stuff, right? We didn't have TikTok on our phone.
Yeah, the games were less immersive. Like you can't play Nintendo for like 6 hours straight. Like it's just like
so. I think
at a certain point you just got to put it down. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think let's include Netflix and streaming shows, everything else, right? Just the ability for you to be able to be solitary and have a lot more to do. Maybe that's a better way.
So too many options basically for your attention.
Correct. And I think at a young age too, because that's the other thing. I had an experience, again, these are anecdotal things, but one of my clients had a graduation party for her son like a year or two ago. My wife and I were just talking about it because we were reminding ourselves that there was about 15 kids, all aged around 17, seniors in high school, that were in the living room and they were silent because literally they're all on their phones.
Yeah.
Some of them were even messaging each other because you could see them giggling and looking up at each other and going back. But we were just like, hold on. When we were 17, if you put 15 high school seniors in a room together, all we'd be doing was talking, right? And engaging each other. So I do think that, especially in some of these articles alluded to this, when you don't have that as a teenager, those formative years, then, because remember, we even did the show on stress, that bullying, that people that are bullied between age like 14 to 17, they develop a certain way long-term because of the way the brain is developing at that age.
Yeah, it changes the development of their brain. Yeah.
Correct. So we can assume that by not engaging and having good interpersonal communications at that age too, it may also alter or maybe not underdeveloped, let's put it that way.
Good and bad, though, because part of it also is to be able to kind of get the bad, shake it off, and keep it moving. Whereas,
I agree, James. That's where I guess I'll finish off is I learned in preparing for today that it's amazing, just like working out our bodies and a lot of other things, like dealing with corporate America and growing in that way as we grow our careers as adults. This whole relationship thing, to be a healthy human being as an adult with relationships means you got to deal with a bit of adversity earlier in your relationship life. And I think that's what I realized in preparing for today is as teenagers, if we have healthy engagement, especially us men, as younger men, we can learn a lot through trial and error as a teenager.
Yeah.
And then once you're in your 20s and 30s, you're better equipped of how to do things like date women and
deal with the ups and downs. I think part of where you're going with that is just that it's easy now to kind of not deal with the downs or to kind of easier to keep yourself out of situations that have to deal with the downs. And so you kind of in your mind, that naturally will have you build up more kind of an aversion to putting yourself in situations where there is a potential downside. And I don't want to romanticize the past and like, oh yeah, everybody was super social and engaged. Like, but I do think the idea of options plays a big role in it. And like just your example, you talk about put 15 teenagers or so in a room together. And yeah, I think the phones play a big deal with that, because I remember, and this is something I observed myself, and then seeing just different scenarios, the phone always gives people an option. This happens on dates, like stuff like that. That gives you an option of something else to do besides what's in front of you. And it's almost like a socially acceptable option. Like people don't look at you like, why do you have your phone out? Like they're like, oh, okay, yeah, people are just sitting there on their phones. And so the option, like if you're sitting in a room with 15 people and there's no other choice, then eventually you're going to start trying to interact with people just because there's nothing else to do. Otherwise, you're just standing there. And so the idea to not just stand there is like, okay, well, I can either stand here and do nothing, or I can try to spark up a conversation, versus I can sit here and be imminently entertained on my phone, or I can take a risk to try to talk to somebody. It changes the calculation completely.
Well, and that's a good point, James. The phone, I think with some of the people, it's less even about being entertained. It's the convenient comfort of not having to take the risk. It's better to be down on your phone like this, because then I don't have to worry about.
It's a safe space. It's a safe space.
Exactly.
And so you can carry a safe space around all the time, but one that kind of turns you inward and doesn't kind of force you to experience outward. And so I think that, again, these aren't like dire circumstances, but it's interesting to see how the technological advances that have a lot of benefits, you were talking about before, like now, you can consider kids safer because they can walk around with a GPS beacon on all the time, and stuff like that. So, but also this can affect in other ways from a social development standpoint. And we don't know, like we're kind of, we've talked about this in other times, like with all of these things, because all this stuff is so new and we're in a transition period, we don't know how this stuff is going to play out for people. Maybe, ultimately by the time people are 30 or 40, it won't matter. And everybody kind of resettles into a acceptable norm. Maybe they don't. One of the things though that is interesting to me, and I like, this is kind of the last point I wanted to get to, is the idea of how the people that really are in charge of designing the technological environments that we're in are oftentimes not the most social people. Like I would say, of all people in the world that I want to take social cues from, or I'd want, like my kids to take social cues from, Mark Zuckerberg is not one of them, so I wonder a lot of times, like the kinds of people that are that are developing these technological environments that we then throw our kids in and let them kind of go. Like those aren't the people that would prioritize social interaction, so we're this is kind of like, there was a movie, there's movies from the age like Revenge of the Nerds or whatever, and I'm not, casting aspersion on nerds, so to speak, but just the idea of, I want to create this, like people seeing the Social Network, I want to create this environment where I can, kind of do this kind of stuff. But now it's like, well, now everybody else has kind of gone into this environment with you and turned their back on a lot of social interaction that, maybe you were interested in turning your back on that interaction, you were developing it. But now it's like, well, hold up. Now, I don't know that everybody should be kind of turning their back on each other in person so that we can interact with this screen.
Well, I don't, it's interesting because that's a great point you make. And I actually want to sit on that real quick, because if you look at this is interesting. So if you look at the technology and the way that a society kind of is dealing or it's kind of just where it is with all that, that kind of elevates what type of mindset is best suited in that environment. So I'll give you an example. Let's say maybe the early 20th century industrial age time, it was actually the more a person, I'll say a man here, because back then it was mostly men, right? A man who's better at sales, honestly, like dealing with people and is gregarious and knows how to deal with relationships was probably the type that would thrive back then, because the internet, all that stuff didn't exist. So you still need to be able to motivate and get people to kind of move around. I'm thinking of someone like maybe Henry Ford. Whatever he was.
That's been most of the time is how well you were able to function in interactive human environments. Right. So that can give you a big leg up.
That's what I'm saying.
That's most time. And that's kind of been flipped on its head now in many respects.
Yeah, well, that's
to the point I know you're going to.
Yeah. So that's where I'm going is think about the last 30, 40 years of, binary code has been the thing that has evolved as the way that not only businesses can grow and all that, but the way that wealth can be generated. So now the people who are best suited to dealing with computers and all that are people that aren't necessarily the most gregarious people getting out there. They weren't they weren't the high school prom queen or the quarterback, right? They were the guys sitting down on the computer in front of the screen, and they were wired that way, which tend to be, and I'm not going to cast aspersions of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, but they tend to be people that are what we would consider maybe on the milder spectrum with issues like Asperger's or something like that. And those tend to be people.
You went somewhere far on that one. I was just more so pointing at him because we saw they had a movie like a quote unquote almost biopic, we kind of saw the way that person was portrayed,
and I'm not sitting here trying to make a point specifically about Mark Zuckerberg, but I'm saying is the personality character that we saw in that film leads you to someone more on that side of how they are versus someone very gregarious and who's, let's say, a salesperson, right?
Well, I would say this. I mean, to me, where I was going is just a person, how much a person would value the ultimate goal here being to avoid contact or to facilitate contact. And so, like, if you're a very personable person, for example, if you designed some social media thing, it wouldn't be geared around keeping you at home, like on your screen.
No, but that's what I'm saying is
trying to get more
people. Think about the mindset of the people that have become successful in the computer in the information age are people like that aren't as socially gregarious and who don't want to be around everybody. They would want to create an environment where from their little room, they can go affect the whole world. And that's kind of what they've done.
My point being, and I guess, you're piggybacking on is just like,
that's what I'm saying.
It's creating more people in their image.
Yes,
it's kind of
that's where I'm getting at. Exactly. Yeah. It's I never really put that together until we're having this conversation. That actually, if you had in an environment, what was that?
I said, actually, I put it together for you.
So for the audience, Socrates over here, and I'll just be. Who can I be?
I'm just messing with you, man. But
let me see. No, because I'm trying. Man, I can't. That one, I drew a blank there.
But
I think about what's the guy? Elmer Fudd. I'll be Elmer Fudd. Date me. No, but basically, I know we want to get out of here.
I want to wrap this up.
The last thing that I'll say is that's why it doesn't surprise me that young men in recent years, if people look at the kind of quote unquote what's called the manosphere, ideas, and we've had a show about this, ideas like the trad wives, those have become popular because I think that's the reaction of a lot of young men who find just dealing with women on a regular basis, like having a conversation or the idea of rejection, is very difficult. So instead of, again, taking the adversity route, it's like, I'd rather just have this woman. All she does is cook, clean, and have babies for me. I don't want to be challenged.
What it is, man, is if you're not comfortable dealing with women on an equal footing, then you want to put them in some place where they're subordinate to you. And that's kind of, so it's a reaction to this thing where if you don't come up learning how to deal with women on an equal footing, and you give and you take and all that kind of stuff, and learning how to do that dance, then you're just like, no, I just want a woman that does everything I say. And it's like, so, and that's not like something that's never been seen in history anyway, otherwise, but it is an interesting direction to go when we supposedly have this super connected society now, where now you got men that aren't even able to deal with women on a eye-to-eye basis, and they're just opting out and being like, I'm just, I'm super masculine, and people just got to do what I say, and so it's just like, and that only works until you come up with somebody who actually really is masculine, and will tell you, where you can take that. I was going to
say, you're basically saying we're turning into the Taliban.
Not me, not you.
Well, not me and you personally, but elements of our culture, yes.
Yeah, for sure. So, but I think we can wrap this topic from there. It's definitely an interesting.
Or we can keep going, James. One or the other.
Say what?
I was like, or we can keep going.
We'll wrap it up. We appreciate all for joining us. We'll have a second part of this episode too, and we'll talk to you then.